So I hope you enjoyed that introduction to cells video. Like I said before, I think it is just an amazing video to show you guys because it shows you how awesome life really is. Now, before we get started talking about life science and what that might mean, I do just want to go over kind of some ground rules. You do have to realize that there are going to be times that we are talking about cells in our body, and we are going to be talking about the human body and different parts of living organisms. So it is going to take a certain level of maturity from you as scientists. So we are looking at all of this information very scientifically. There is nothing inappropriate that we're going to be covering, but you guys do need to be mature as sixth graders in order to cover this. So, you might see an image of the human body without any clothes on. You are going to see pictures of egg cells and sperm cells, and that is okay because there's nothing inappropriate. It's just part of how we're made. So I do hope as we're going through this, lesson and unit that you guys can be mature and be respectful of the human body and the life science that we're learning about. So with that being said, on my smartboard here, I kind of have pulled up, we're going to talk about what does it mean to be just living in general. So at this point in time, I want you to pause the video and I want you to go over to my Moodle page and actually a link, and I want you to start thinking about what do you think is living and what do you think is not living. Okay, so you should have paused your video. You should have done that quick little survey for me just to see what you thought was living and what you thought wasn't living. Now we're going to go over, scientists do have kind of a list of things that or characteristics that they look for in something that would be classified as living. There are quite a few that are kind of a little bit above us at this point. We're going to focus on 3 of those characteristics. I'm going to just clarify, this is not the whole list. We're just starting with 3 of them. So they have to be able to have cells, they have to be able to grow, and they must be able to reproduce. So with that, my question for you is, do you think atoms are living? I want you just on a scrap sheet of paper to write your answer down. So I'm going to ask you, do you think that atoms have cells? Can atoms grow? And can atoms reproduce? And the answer to all 3 of those questions are no. So if we take a look here, we're going to see that atoms are not living. Everything that we have studied up to this point in science class has been all not living, which is why I put them in that order so that we could kind of segment between life science and more of your physics and chemistry. So even though atoms do kind of move, and some people would argue that atoms grow because they can gain electrons or lose electrons, and atoms can split, they can't really reproduce to make more atoms, and they're not made up of cells. So what we end up kind of finding out, though, is that atoms are the basic, unit of all things. They're matter. They're the basic unit of matter. Now, we are considered living. Plants are considered living. And we know that they're also considered matter. So what is really kind of the cool mystery of life at this point is we are made up of atoms that are non-living, but they're able to make up living things, which is a cell. And the smallest unit of a living thing that's living is a cell. So we're going to kind of get into that because I know that sometimes that can be a little bit confusing. We'll talk about that more in depth. But I do want you, even if you just have to memorize it, atoms are not living, cells are living. So let's go ahead and get this down into our notes. I'm going to drag this over. Sorry, my computer's acting very slow today. It's a little glitchy. So we're just going to put down the characteristics of living things. And so they have cells, they must grow, and they must be able to reproduce. And we're just going to put a little kind of side note down here. Atoms are not living. And I'm just going to put that in all caps with an exclamation point because that's something that you definitely want to remember. Okay, so we said that atoms are the smallest unit of matter, And cells are the smallest unit of life. So, cell is the smallest living unit of structure and function in a living organism. Well, what does that kind of mean? A cell is the smallest living unit of that makes up of, that's kind of what we mean by structure. Structure is the part, the look, it's made up of something. So if we say like, what is the building kind of structured out of? We would say, well, it's structured out of metal, beams, and wood, and brick. So that means that when we're looking at like the humans or plants or animals, the smallest unit of life that makes it up is a cell. And then it also has a function. What function is having a job. So not only does that cell helping to make it up, but it also has a job. It's there to do something. Just like the metal support beams in our building, the function of those would be to support the building so that the building doesn't come crashing down. Now, another vocabulary term that you're really going to have to be aware of that you're going to hear me use all the time is organism. It's something that can live on its own, and it has all of the characteristics of life. We have two different types of organisms that we can talk about. We can talk about multicellular organism, and we can talk about unicellular organisms. So if we just use kind of some of the clues of our words, we can figure out what these mean. We know that an organism is something that's living, and if it's multicellular, if we focus on that word cell and we know what multi means, which is many, it's an organism that's going to be made up of many cells. So an example of a multicellular organism would be us, plants, and other animals. We can also have a unicellular organism. And if you know what this prefix means, you should be thinking in your head what it means. One, like unicycle, unicorn, one. So it's a one-celled organism, which is really kind of crazy for us to think about. But it's one tiny little cell that can live completely on its own. So we're going to look at some examples of that as we're kind of going through, because I want you to be able to experience as many different cells as possible. So to kind of help you just get a visual of what this looks like, we see that organisms can be broken down into two groups. And then we have examples of that unicellular, because that's going to be the one that you're kind of probably not very familiar with. So an amoeba, bacteria, or paramecium. Those are the three things that we see that are just one cell living completely on their own. Now, you've probably heard of bacteria because you can digest bacteria, and that's what can make you sick. Amoebas, believe it or not, live in pond water. So if you ever accidentally get some water in your mouth while you're swimming in a pond or an ocean or a lake, you probably have consumed some amoebas and paramecia. And so just to kind of give you another picture of what those might look like here, these three right here, kind of the green colored ones, these are different examples of what a bacteria cell. So you have many unicellular organisms in this picture. This one guy right here, though, can live all by himself. And then down here, I'm going to hide my picture for a second. Right here, this is an amoeba. And so these are the little guys that live in water. And you can see like right here how they actually eat. They engulf their food, and that's what he's doing right there. So if you were to look at pond water underneath a microscope, you would actually see these single-celled organisms going about and living. And it's really cool to watch. You'll get a chance to see that later on in the chapter. Now, what we're really kind of focused on is going to be the multicellular organism. And I know I'm still hidden because I want you to kind of be able to see this whole picture. But if we start with a multicellular organism like a human or an animal, and you're going to hear humans be referenced as animals sometimes in life science. So if we have animal cells, there can also be human cells kind of talking about that at the same time. Okay, so now that you kind of saw that, I'm going to unhide me. Okay, so when you look here, we have this organism. If we were to kind of break the organism down and go smaller and smaller, we're going to look at individual organ systems. So this right here is showing you the digestive system. You might have heard of your nervous system or cardiovascular system. Those are all of the systems that work together to make up an organism. You are going to get a chance to actually delve into some of those organ systems if you get far enough along in your to-do list for life science. Then, if we kind of break that down and look at just one piece of the organ system, we're going to be looking at the organ. So like this right here is your stomach. That would be an example of an organ. Or your heart is an organ, or your brain is an organ. And those organs are made up of tissues put together. And so tissue is just a group of similar cells working together. So then we look at this, and if we were to tear the tissue down to the smallest little piece, we would get a cell. The cell is the smallest unit that can kind of live on its own and function in a living thing. Now, what gets kind of weird is the cells are made up of smaller pieces that are organelles. Now, we would still consider these organelles living, but they can't really live on their own. It's kind of like inside of a watch. The organelles are kind of like a gear. Now, the gear is definitely part of a watch, but if you take it out of the watch, it's not going to work. You have to have it put in with all of the other pieces in order to get it to work. And that's kind of like what my computer will shift back. An organelle is. It's a little piece of the cell that, while it is still living, it's not necessarily going to be able to survive on its own for long periods of time. So that's why you'll notice everything that is considered to be living, I have kind of outlined in green. And the organelle, I really didn't outline it because it's kind of a weird little piece. Now, if we continue to go smaller, the words that I have outlined in red, those things are non-living. Now, they're still matter, but they're not living. So we have macromolecules, which are just really, really huge, huge chains of molecules. So this would be like your fats, which are known as lipids, your sugars, okay, which are some of like your carbohydrates. Those are macromolecules. And then we can take it down even smaller to a molecule. And we know from our early studies in the year that if we break down a molecule, we would get just one atom. So this is how kind of everything that we've been studying so far this year comes together, and you're seeing it put all together as a whole. Now, I want to go back here, and let's just add into our notes some of those important terms that we need to know. So we talked about what a cell is. And I'm going to kind of make cell like my next big heading because that's what we're going to be focusing on now for a while. Okay, my computer is running super slow. So it's the smallest living unit of structure and function in an organism. And so just to remember, we talked about, you're going to hear me say structure and function a lot. So if you don't understand what those mean, it's going to be very, very important that you kind of get that down underneath your definition. So structure is going to be considered like the part, the look, what something's made up of. And when we talk about structure a lot, especially with our different cells, we're going to find out that cells look a certain way because of the job that they do or their function. So function is also a word for job. And then we talked about organism. It's something that can live on its own. It has all the characteristics of life. And so if we kind of tab that over, because we know we can have multicellular, which would be many-celled. And examples of that would be humans, plants, animals. Or we can have unicellular, which would be single-celled. And that would be an amoeba or bacteria. Very good. Now, when we were talking about the whole structure and function, I told you that one of your tasks is going to kind of be to figure out, a cell looks the way that it does because of the job that it has. And so when we look at a multicellular organism, specifically a human, we're going to see that it has a lot of different types of cells. You actually have 217 different types of cells making up your body. And so we're going to figure out, well, like, why do we think that a nerve cell would have all of these long little branching things here? So you need to kind of relate structure and function always together. And then you can also see a different multicellular organism where these would be of plants, and they look very different than the cells that a lot of animals and humans would have, and there's a reason for that. So we're also going to be studying the difference between plant cells and animal cells. So for now, what I want you guys to do, this was just a brief intro. There's a lot of memorizing in life science. That's just kind of how it is. So you're going to have a lot of concept cards, a lot of Quizlet card studying time. It's going to be a lot of memorization. But this first activity is actually going to be a little bit more of just you thinking through the problems. So I want you to go next and do the structure and function activity. It's going to be challenging, but you're going to have to look at some of the different cells that do exist and some of the different functions and try to match up those functions and structures together and then give a rationale or a reasoning why you match those up together and see what you thought. So that is your next step, and have a good rest of your day.